The wedding dress outweighed the bride. Inside the glowing halls of St. Paul's Cathedral, hundreds of candles shimmered against stained glass, and the organ thundered through the stone vaults. Nobles from two kingdoms looked on as a little girl, 6 years old, was led toward a man more than 2 decades her senior. Isabel of France, barely tall enough to carry the weight of the silk and gold draped over her shoulders, was about to be married. Not because she loved, not because she chose, but because she was born a princess. What you're about to learn isn't some ancient myth or distant barbaric custom. This was London. This was Paris. This was the supposed height of civilization, and the true horror was buried in the details. Let's rewind, just a few years before that wedding day, to Isabel's beginning. November 9th, 1389, the Louvre. Palace echoed with screams, but not from a birth. King Charles VI of France, Isabel's father, was deep in a psychotic break. He believed he was made of glass and that any touch would shatter him into pieces. Guards were instructed to avoid all contact. The king cowered in corners, crying of invisible enemies lurking in the walls. Elsewhere in the palace, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria gave birth to their 4th daughter. They named her Isabel. From the moment she was born, her role was set, not as a child, but as a future transaction. Her mother, barely glancing at her newborn, already knew what she'd be used for: a bargaining chip. Another piece on the ever-shifting chessboard of royal diplomacy. Isabel's earliest memories weren't of playrooms or lullabies, but of ceremonies and strategy. Her toys were miniatures of royal courts. Her bedtime stories were lessons in statecraft. While other children were learning to read, Isabel was learning how to bow correctly to foreign dignitaries. Every gesture, every smile, every word she spoke in public was rehearsed. Her education wasn't shaped by dreams, but by duty. At the center of this cold preparation stood Queen Isabeau, her mother. She ruled in her husband's stead whenever madness consumed him, and she thrived in his instability. With every episode of delusion or rage, she gained more control over the kingdom and its coffers. Contemporaries didn't speak kindly of her. Even court-approved chroniclers, who were supposed to praise the royal family, wrote bitterly about her selfishness. One scribe remarked she treasured her jewels more than her children. Others whispered of her lovers, received in chambers next to the king's, while Charles screamed in madness. This was Isabel's model of motherhood, a queen who loved power more than people, a woman who used her children as currency. The royal household wasn't a place of safety. France was fracturing under pressure. 2 political factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought viciously for control. Poisonings, kidnappings, and assassinations were common. Even the youngest princes and princesses had armed guards. Isabel didn't play in gardens. She learned to recognize the gleam of a dagger. Worse still, she learned to fear her own father. Charles VI's descent into madness wasn't gradual. It arrived like storms. One moment he was speaking poetry to courtiers. The next, he stripped naked and ran screaming through the palace. Sometimes he forgot he had children. Other times he believed they were demons sent to destroy him. Isabel was only 4 when she watched her father try to strangle her mother in a fit of delusion. She knew the signs before the doctors did, how his hands would tremble, how the room would fall silent, how everyone nearby would slowly edge toward the exit, hoping to escape before the king lost control. She learned these survival tactics before she learned her letters. Historians have spent centuries glorifying medieval courts, but tucked inside old treasury records is a single entry that reveals something horrifying. In 1394, when Isabel was 5, the royal budget paid for iron bars to be added to her chamber windows, not for decoration, not for defense from intruders, but because she had tried to jump. Let that settle. A 5-year-old princess had already decided that death was better than the life she'd been given. It's the kind of detail official histories leave out, but the evidence remains, quiet, damning, and real. Peace bought with a child. In 1395, messengers from England arrived. King Richard II, nearly 30 and recently widowed, was desperate for peace and heirs. His nobles were restless, his treasury empty from years of war. And Isabel's mother saw an opportunity. The French court began drafting a proposal, a truce, territorial concessions, and nearly 30 years of peace, in exchange for one little girl. Isabel. At just 6 years old, she was to be married to a man she had never met, from a country she had never seen, whose language she didn't speak. Grown men sat around carved tables debating her value. Her age was a concern. English envoys thought 6 might be too young, but French diplomats had a response that should chill us even now. If Richard took Isabel young, they said, he could mold her entirely to his liking. She would know only his customs, only his rules, only his desires. She would be, in their words, completely his. This wasn't just political alliance, it was legalized, state-negotiated grooming, displayed like livestock. The English demanded to inspect the girl first, not meet, not greet, inspect. Isabel was made to walk before them, to smile, to speak. They checked her teeth, her posture, her gait. One lord was overheard saying she would ripen beautifully. She was 6, and yet the deal was signed. 800,000 livres, the equivalent of 2 full years of English royal income, would be paid by France. The marriage wouldn't be consummated until she was older, the contract stated, but all other rights of a husband. Richard would receive them immediately. Rights to decide where she lived, who she saw, what she learned, where she slept. Everything. When they told Isabel she would become Queen of England, her only question was this: "May I bring my dolls?" Not her jewelry, not her title, not the man she'd marry. Her dolls. Because she was still a child, but the court didn't see her as one. They saw her as an investment, wrapped in silk, trained in silence, and sold to the highest bidder. Isabel's wedding wasn't a ceremony. It was a transaction wrapped in gold. By the summer of 1396, the deal was sealed. France would provide an astronomical dowry, nearly 2 years of English royal income, in exchange for a temporary peace and the return of lost territories. The cruelty, however, was hidden in the fine print. The marriage would not be consummated until Isabel reached the proper age, but Richard would receive all other husbandly rights at once: control over where she lived, who she saw, what she learned, even where she slept. Medieval logic dictated that young brides should grow used to their husband's presence early. In other words, they believed conditioning a 6-year-old child to share a bed with a grown man was not only acceptable, it was prudent. When they informed Isabel that she was to become the Queen of England, she asked her governess if she would be allowed to bring her dolls. That single question, scribbled later in a letter, stands as the most damning line in the entire saga. The court responded with celebration. Seamstresses worked around the clock, creating an opulent trousseau: 12 wedding dresses, 40 ceremonial gowns, heirloom jewels from 3 generations of queens, everything tailored to a 6-year-old's frame. Her mother, Isabeau, who had shown little warmth during Isabel's early years, now obsessed over every wedding detail. This wasn't love, it was triumph. She'd successfully bartered her daughter for peace and political capital. Poets penned verses praising the wisdom of the match. No verses were written for the child being shipped off like cargo. The farewell was a spectacle. On the day of departure, King Charles, lucid for once, blessed Isabel with trembling hands. He held her so tightly that attendants had to pry his arms apart. Whatever he whispered into her ear made her break into sobs that didn't stop, even as she was led away. Witnesses claimed she screamed for her father long after the palace disappeared from sight. The journey from Paris to Calais took 2 weeks. Isabel barely ate or slept. She clutched a wooden doll so tightly her palms began to blister. Upon reaching the coast, the handover unfolded with cold precision. The English delegation had erected a tent city, miles of silk pavilions flying royal banners, performers entertaining crowds. A celebration for everyone except the girl at its center. At the exact middle of a marked field, French and English nobles met. Latin was spoken, papers signed, gold exchanged. And just like that, Isabel no longer belonged to France. She belonged to England. Immediately, the English did what conquerors do. They stripped her identity. Her French attendants were dismissed. Her governess, the only maternal figure she'd known, was sent back across the channel. Her ladies-in-waiting were replaced by English women she couldn't understand. Even her tiny dog, the pet she'd been promised could stay with her, was taken away because Richard didn't like small dogs. Every familiar anchor, gone in an hour. The journey to London blurred past in a haze of strange languages and foreign faces. The English tried to make it festive. Towns were ordered to cheer as the procession passed. Bells rang. People crowded streets. But to Isabel, the noise was terrifying. She later confessed to a priest that she thought the crowds were marching her to her execution. She wasn't entirely wrong. November 1396. London had never seen a show like this. Westminster Palace was swathed in cloth of gold. Barges filled the Thames. Banners of England and France fluttered across the skyline. Every bell in the city rang until nightfall, and inside St. Paul's Cathedral, transformed into something that looked more like a fever dream than a church, a 29-year-old man waited to marry a child. Richard II looked every bit the monarch. Tall, handsome, wrapped in robes worth a noble's estate. He wasn't nervous about marrying a 6-year-old. He was nervous about the politics. Would this alliance bring peace? Would the French pay in full? Would his people accept a child queen who couldn't bear heirs for a decade? When Isabel entered the cathedral, a gasp rippled through the crowd, not of admiration, but shock. She was so small, 2 attendants had to carry the train of her wedding robes. The crown made for her tiny head kept slipping. She shuffled more than she walked, led like a prisoner to the altar. Witnesses from across Europe scribbled notes about the surreal scene. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, kneeling to reach her height. When asked for her consent, Isabel couldn't speak. An English lady had to whisper the words to her, and she repeated them so faintly only those standing closest could hear. "I will." 2 words that sealed her fate. When the time came for the ring, Richard's hands engulfed hers. The child flinched when he touched her. The ring, despite being specially crafted, still had to be forced onto her finger. She winced. No one stopped the ceremony. As tradition dictated, Richard kissed her forehead, the only merciful deviation from a grotesque ritual. The feast that followed was obscene in its extravagance. 2,000 guests, swans stuffed with peacock, wines from every corner of Europe. Entertainers performed between courses that could have fed starving villages for months. Isabel was placed at the high table in a custom chair that raised her to adult height. She didn't eat. She couldn't. The Archbishop of York later wrote that she stared at the wall for the entire meal, her eyes blank. And yet, the worst part of the day still lay ahead. The medieval bedding ceremony, a traditional end to noble weddings, wasn't optional. Though actual consummation was not expected, the ritual itself involved priests blessing the marriage bed and courtiers escorting the bride and groom into it. Isabel was placed under heavy sheets in her shift, clutching the one French doll she'd been allowed to keep. Richard entered in nightclothes. The court looked on as he climbed into bed beside a 6-year-old child. The curtains were drawn. The crowd left. Isabel was alone with her husband. What happened next, no one truly knows. Richard later swore he never touched her inappropriately, and no records suggest otherwise. But the morning after, Isabel's attendants found her curled into a corner of the massive bed, silent and unmoving. She didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, her first words were in French. "When can I go home?" The answer, of course, was never. And yet, here's the unexpected twist. Richard, despite being part of this monstrous transaction, seemed to show her genuine care. He created a household for her at Windsor Castle, staffed with French speakers. He gave her gifts not of jewels, but toys, books, and a white pony she named Blanche. Was this kindness, or was it grooming, disguised in affection? Historians still debate the line. Isabel, slowly, began to trust him. She called him "my Lord Uncle," perhaps the only way she could make sense of the man who was both protector and captor. Richard appeared in portraits with her, seated beside her tiny frame, her hand placed gently on his arm. He wrote poems about innocence and guardianship. He even punished courtiers who mocked her or treated her with disrespect. But let's be clear, a kind jailer is still a jailer. A gentle predator is still a predator, and a child bride treated well is still a child bride. Isabel's life in England settled into a disturbing rhythm. She was paraded before foreign ambassadors, praised for her manners, admired for her ability to recite English poetry or perform ceremonial dances. But in private, she still played with dolls. She still screamed herself awake from nightmares. She still cried for her father in a land she didn't understand. And at every turn, the horror wore a crown and smiled for the court. Life in England for young Isabel settled into a strange rhythm, part spectacle, part silence. After the wedding, Richard II arranged a household for her at Windsor Castle, surrounding her with carefully chosen French-speaking attendants, books, toys, and even a white pony she named Blanche. To outsiders, it might have looked like kindness, a child queen being pampered. But beneath the gold-threaded tapestries and royal ceremonies, Isabel remained a possession. Her smiles expected, her movements observed, her future already planned by men who saw her as a symbol, not a soul. Richard, nearly 5 times her age, maintained a distant sort of affection. He visited regularly, offered her ornate gifts, and even commissioned paintings where she stood beside him like a porcelain doll. Courtiers whispered he was unusually gentle with her, that he showed her real affection. But affection under captivity is still a form of control. Isabel, still a child, began to trust him, calling him "my Lord Uncle," a title that betrayed her confusion and longing for familiarity. She learned English. She attended court rituals. She learned to stand still and smile when foreign ambassadors stared at her as if she were a rare gem. But when the halls were empty and her crown was removed, she cried into her pillow for the home she'd lost and the family she wasn't sure remembered her. Richard's court was a stage, and she was its most precious prop. Back in France, her father descended further into madness. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, continued her corrupt grip on power. The dowry, meant to buy peace, was gone within 2 years, spent on Richard's extravagant palaces and failing military campaigns. Isabel, far from home, began writing letters. Fragmented, heavily censored, and rarely answered, they show a young girl's mind fraying under the weight of isolation. "I pray for you daily," she wrote to her aunt. "Do you still remember me?" To her family, she sent drawings, little gifts, tokens of a child begging not to be forgotten. She was just 7 years old. One letter to her confessor reveals the depth of her loneliness. She wrote that sometimes she imagined her old dog curling up beside her bed and cried when she remembered it had been taken from her. Then came 1399, the year everything changed. Richard's rule had become unbearable, marked by cruelty, paranoia, and reckless spending. When he seized the lands of Henry Bolingbroke, the exiled Duke of Lancaster, Henry raised an army and returned. Support for Richard collapsed in a matter of weeks. He was arrested without a fight, his allies deserted him, and his crown was quietly stripped from his head. Richard's downfall meant something different to each court faction, but to Isabel, it was the sudden end of the only structure she had come to understand. In a single day, she transformed from Queen of England to the widow of a deposed monarch. She was just 10 years old. Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle and vanished from the world. Months later, rumours swirled. He had died, some said by starvation, others by murder. Isabel was not permitted to see him, not allowed a goodbye. The man who had been both captor and caretaker was gone, and no one explained why. Her screams echoed through the corridors as she begged to be told where he had gone. When no one answered, she stopped asking. With Richard gone, Isabel became a political burden. The new king, Henry IV, had no use for a French child in his court. The dowry money was spent, the alliance broken. He couldn't send her back, not without embarrassment, and he couldn't remarry her, not without time. So he locked her away at Havering Palace. Officially, she was an honoured guest. In practice, she was a prisoner, forbidden from returning home, from receiving letters without review, from speaking her own language without supervision. She spent her days in a gilded cage. Her attendants were reduced. Her access to the outside world shrank to almost nothing. For 3 long years, from age 10 to 13, Isabel lived in silence, her childhood dissolving behind stone walls. Her letters from this time, rarely preserved, are filled with aching loneliness. In one she wrote, "I speak to the walls in French, so I do not forget my voice." In another, "I dream of my home and wake to prison." She began to sleep during the day and stay awake at night, wandering the halls alone with only shadows for company. One letter, never sent, discovered years later behind a panel in her chamber, was addressed to Richard. "They say you are dead, but I do not believe it," she wrote. "You promised to protect me. I wait for you still." It was signed simply, "Your Isabel." A 13-year-old girl still waiting for a dead man to return and rescue her from a world that had never truly cared for her. That single letter says more than any royal archive ever could. Her silence in those years wasn't apathy, it was survival. Her loneliness wasn't melodrama, it was systemic cruelty hidden behind protocol and lace. The court no longer praised her beauty or poise. She was politically useless, legally confusing, and personally inconvenient. The king tried to force a solution. He suggested Isabel marry his son, the future Henry V. The young girl refused. For the first time in her life, she stood her ground, declaring, "I am Richard's widow. I will marry no English prince." It stunned the court. The docile child bride had found her voice, and it said no. With that single act of defiance, she turned from a pawn into a player. She began writing again, this time with strategy. She hid letters in the lining of clothing, passed messages through French-speaking physicians, built quiet alliances with servants. The child queen became a teenager who understood the game and was learning how to play it. But the damage was done. Her early years, those precious formative years, had been eaten by silence, fear, and ceremony. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a girl of 13. She saw someone far older, someone exhausted. Her life in England, her captivity, her coerced marriage, and her long imprisonment had drained her of innocence long before her body caught up. The girl who had arrived with golden curls and a doll in her arms was now a gaunt, quiet teenager who didn't speak unless spoken to and flinched when voices rose. She would soon return to France, but the echoes of England would never leave her. Not in her posture, not in her nightmares, not in the quiet, practiced way she avoided hope. The child who had been sold for peace had survived, but barely. At last, after years of silence, a door opened for Isabel. But what returned to France in 1401 was not a child, but a girl hollowed out by captivity. She was only 13, yet she moved and spoke like someone twice her age. Her face, once round with youth, had grown sharp. Her eyes, once wide with curiosity, now carried the wary distance of someone trained by fear. The long-awaited homecoming was nothing like the stories she'd dreamt up during her imprisonment. Her father, Charles VI of France, had briefly emerged from the fog of madness to demand her return. In that flicker of lucidity, he remembered her, remembered the daughter who had been sold to a foreign king, and his rage rattled the entire French court. But by the time Isabel arrived, the madness had swallowed him again. He no longer recognized her. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, greeted her not with maternal warmth, but with political calculation. Isabel had once been a valuable diplomatic tool. Now she was a used one, damaged, diminished, and inconvenient. France itself had descended further into chaos. Civil war between rival factions made Paris a battleground. The court changed hands as frequently as the weather, and amidst all this instability, Isabel's return stirred little excitement. There were no parades, no banners, just the quiet reintegration of a girl who had been forgotten for too long. Still, something miraculous happened. At 15, Isabel was married again, this time not to an old king who needed a treaty, but to a young man with ink-stained fingers and a poet's soul. Charles, Duke of Orleans, was close to her in age and temperament. Sensitive, kind, and cultured, he treated Isabel not as a tool or trophy, but as a person. Their marriage, arranged by the court, unexpectedly bloomed into something close to real affection. For the first time in her life, Isabel was not simply surviving. she was living. Contemporary accounts describe her smiling more freely, laughing gently, walking through the gardens with a peace she had never known in England. With Charles, she could speak her language, read poetry, and be understood. In his verses, she was not a symbol of political alliance, but a woman of substance and sorrow. For a brief, luminous period, Isabel knew what it meant to be loved, not because of what she represented, but because of who she was. That happiness reached its quiet peak in 1409 with the birth of their daughter, Jean. Witnesses said Isabel beamed with a joy so radiant that it stunned those who had only known her as somber and silent. She held her daughter with a ferocity born from years of being unheld, unprotected, unmothered. At last, she had someone to keep safe, someone who was hers. But the joy came at a price. Years of emotional deprivation and physical neglect had left Isabel's body fragile. The birth, though successful, took a heavy toll. She never fully recovered. The girl who had once withstood exile, humiliation, and captivity now found herself unable to heal from the one act that brought her real joy. Her strength faltered day by day. Physicians tried their remedies, but her condition only worsened. Some said her body was simply too weak. Others whispered that it was not the birth, but the weight of everything she had carried for so long that finally crushed her spirit. Isabel died quietly, without fanfare, on September the 13th, 1409. She was just 20 years old. A queen twice over, a widow once, a bride sold and a bride chosen, a political pawn, and finally, a mother. Her final request was simple: to hold her daughter one more time. The infant Jean was placed in her arms, and Isabel whispered something. Soft, private, words meant only for her child. No one heard what was said. That final secret belonged only to them. The court recorded her death with cold brevity. 3 lines, no more, noting the political consequences, but not the personal tragedy. A young woman had died, and with her died the echo of a lifetime that had never truly belonged to her. Isabel's grave bore titles: Queen of England, Duchess of Orleans, but not the truth. It did not say survivor, it did not say child sacrificed, it did not say girl sold for peace. But we know better now. Her life, scattered across letters, chroniclers' asides, and overlooked documents, tells the real story. A child used, broken, and quietly discarded by the powers of her time. And yet, she was not erased. Because we remember her, not as a footnote, but as a mirror held up to the face of medieval Europe. She was the cost of politics, the collateral of kings. Her suffering wasn't the tragic price of some greater good. It was preventable. It was orchestrated, it was called diplomacy, and it was anything but civilized. Through Isabel, we glimpsed the truth about a world that dressed cruelty in velvet and called it tradition, about a society that bought and sold girls and convinced itself it was noble, about the damage done not by monsters, but by people in crowns who believed they were righteous. That's her legacy. Not as a ruler, but as a witness. Not for her titles, but for her tears. The child who asked if she could bring her dolls to her wedding deserves that much. If Isabel's story moved you, if her voice, buried for centuries, finally reached you, leave a comment below. Just type, remembered, so the world knows she wasn't forgotten. Like this video if you believe history should remember the victims, not just the victors. Subscribe to uncover more hidden truths the history books left out. From forgotten queens to silent survivors, there's so much still buried.